Hey everyone, I hope you are doing well. I hope you're holding up well. We are doing part 3 of Buddhism, or maybe 2B. I don't know. This is going to be kind of a long one, probably a full hour is pushing my computer as far as it'll go with this one, I think. So we've got a lot to cover. It's going to go pretty quickly, pretty dense, so please feel free to pause it, rewind it, etc. If you need to, okay? So I know obviously I don't have to say that, but I thought I'd remind you anyway. All right, so first of all, we were looking at Mahayana Buddhism, which is the great vehicle. And that's where we really see a lot of splintering. A source of, becomes a source of question, is this really Buddhism? Does it lose some of its soul as it goes further out geographically and chronologically? But it becomes extremely malleable, which all religions really have to do. If they're going to work in other cultures, if they're going to expand into other areas, they have to be flexible, because otherwise the religion doesn't speak to the people, right? Because the priorities might be different, the values are different, the language is different. Ideas about divinity and ultimate reality are very different and may not be in agreement. So we're going to see how Mahayana Buddhism, how flexible it really becomes. So one of the places it changes a lot is in China. So we're going to take a look at Buddhism in China. First, it enters China around the end of the 2nd century CE. So it's been in India for a long time. It goes into Southeast Asia first. We're not looking at that very closely because those cultures tend to be very small, and so they don't make huge changes to it. And Theravada Buddhism is really takes a hold there. But those are also places where Hinduism had a big impact. So Indian culture, Indian ideas were already there, and Buddhism goes in there, and that old school Theravada culture, grabs a hold there. And so it doesn't change Buddhism hugely, but in China, it really makes some big difference. So into the 2nd century CE, this is during the end of the Han Dynasty. And it comes in at the end of a stable period. So when things are kind of starting to get unstable, a little more chaos, there's, looking back to this good old days of when everything was fine and lovely and cheap and you could get a pair of jeans for $10 or whatever, right? When you get this kind of instability coming up, people start looking for something new. They start looking for something different that will serve them better. At the end of the day, religion really is a tit-for-tat relationship. And if your religion is not serving you, if it is not supporting you, if it is not giving you the answers that you need for either, day-to-day questions, how do I get food on the table, or ultimate reality questions, if it's not a satisfactory answer, the religion has to change, or people go looking for something else. And that's kind of what happens here. So in China, Confucianism was really big, right? Now, Confucianism is, it's more a philosophy than it is a religion, but it emphasizes kind of filial piety, respect for your elders, like very proper hierarchies, proper ritual. Ritual is kind of the basis of social stability in Confucianism, and it kind of emphasizes just basic goodness and proper respect for order. And this becomes a very stabilizing influence for China, but it doesn't really address those ultimate realities, like what is the nature of the world? What is the nature of divinity? Those kinds of questions, right? And Confucianism they're really just looking to make sure that society is stable and kind of boring, right? And so there's a great Confucian line, may you never live in interesting times, right? And that kind of sums it all up right there. So we've got some stabilizing forces. Whoops, where am I? My notes are, there we go. Some stabilizing forces of the dynasty were in decline. So when people crave stability, they're willing to try new things, like I just said. And Buddhism was one of those newfangled things that came across the Silk Road. It took a long time because there were lots of hurdles to overcome, right? So it gets delayed by things like language, Sanskrit and Chinese are nowhere near connected. Like they're not related at all. And so language becomes a barrier. And even once you get over the language barrier, how do you express those ideas to Chinese people, right? And it's kind of like, think about how much trouble you're having uh, kind of figuring out Buddhism from what tends to be a Western mindset, or even if, Jain, right? If you're a Jain, you're coming out of that Hindu context, and yet Buddhism can still mess with your head a little bit. So how do you express this to people who have never encountered it before and may have very different priorities? And that becomes another hurdle for them. All right. It's really concerned, like we've noted before, Buddhism is really concerned with the big stuff. They're not overly concerned with how are you going to get food on your table tonight? How are you going to make sure the crops grow? How do I make sure my horse doesn't get sick? Those kinds of things, right? And so they have trouble looking for ways to fit this into a Chinese context in a really accessible way, and a way that really addresses what the Chinese are looking for. And so one of the ways they do this is they start emphasizing bodhisattvas. All right. Let's see here. We're going to look at one of the things they do look to is Taoism. And Taoism is an indigenous religion in China. And it has some really nice affinities with Buddhism. And Taoism ends up changing Buddhism tremendously. Not at its core, but it gives it some new nuances that it didn't have before. So it's very old, and it provided a counterpoint. Taoism provided a counterpoint to that Confucianism. It advocated retreat from community. Confucianism, it advocated being part of the community. It advocated inactivity and contemplation, right? Which again is very different from Confucianism. And so one of the ways that Buddhism really connects with Taoism really well is realizing that this ultimate reality is so big and so grand that it's mystical. It's hard to talk about. And so one of the things you find in Taoism is this idea that the Tao is unnamed, because the Tao that can be spoken of is not the true Tao. And we could say the same thing about Brahman, right? Or even Atman, right? So we find here places where the two kind of naturally come together and kind of interconnect really well. And so Taoism became the way for Buddhism to work its way into China. Let me see here, make sure I've got everything here. Okay. The Tao so for Taoism, Tao is the origin of all things. Which Buddhism doesn't really care about. And I don't know if I shared the story, but there's a story about a man who goes to the Buddha and he says, I will convert to Buddhism if you answer my questions. And the Buddha says, well, ask your questions. And the guy says, can you tell me the origin of all things? Can you tell me where it all starts, where it all begins? And the Buddha looks at him and says, who cares, essentially, right? He looks at the man and he says, you are like a man who has been hit by an arrow, and before you allow me to take the arrow out and remove the suffering, you want to know about the feathers on the arrow. You want to know what the arrow is made of. Where is the bow that sent the arrow into my body, right, and has inflicted this suffering? The origin of things don't matter to Buddhism. Buddhism is concerned with suffering now and removing it. So this brings into Buddhism a more of a contemplative contemplative tradition of thinking about the origins of things, which Buddhism did not have before. The Tao is empty; it can never be filled, right? And so that's another great place where Buddhism is just going to come right in and go, "Oh, emptiness. We know about emptiness," right? So they get along really well there. They kind of become BFFs. The Tao Te Ching, emptiness is important, as is the utility of things, right? So being practical and figuring out practical ways to enlightenment or salvation. There are some implications in Taoism that are different, that impacted Buddhism. as it was translated into China. The idea of the flowing, sorry, the idea of flowing with the world and being in harmony with the world around you. Buddhism never really addresses that, but for Taoism, if you've looked at Alan Watts, who is a really great introduction into these Eastern traditions. He puts it in a way that is very, very accessible. I highly recommend Alan Watts if you're interested in this stuff. But he wrote one called Tao the Watercourse Way, which was really, it was very influential to me when I was younger. And it is this idea with Taoism that, you take the watercourse way, you take the path of least resistance. The universe is moving in a certain direction and you kind of have to move with it, right? Don't fight it, because the more you fight it, the more you're going to suffer. Buddhism never really deals with that. It never really thought about that. But with Taoism and Buddhism working together now, kind of talking to each other, they definitely pick up that idea of least resistance. So as Buddhism goes into China, it does make some changes. Enlightenment can come from a simple practice. And wise acceptance of this is part of just simple enlightenment. In the now, it becomes more concerned with nature, right? And so these are impacts from Taoism. In the north, you have a lot more nomadic people. We have the Huns hanging out up there, right? The Mongolian tribes and the Huns. They liked Buddhism because it's not geographically centered, right? When you have other traditions, very often are connected to the land. And so, for example, I think the easiest example of this would have to be Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. So focused on Jerusalem, right? Even if you had a space in another country where you could put a Jewish homeland, they wouldn't go there because they are connected to Jerusalem, right? And the same thing is going to be true of Islam. Buddhism doesn't care. Buddhism doesn't really have a homeland. It doesn't have some great connection to geography. The Bodhi tree in India is a sacred site, and there are certainly sacred sites kind of all over the place, but they're not like do or die to the religion, to the faith, to the practice. All right. And so that's really helpful, right? For the people who are nomadic and wandering around, who don't have necessarily a home base or a homeland. For peasants, it brings hope for the world beyond now. So it kind of gives, if your life seems kind of hopeless, like you can't move up, you can't make things better, but maybe in the next life it'll be better. For academics, for intellectuals, it gives an intellectual escape into the ideas of Buddhism and Taoism. It's no longer kind of like this unusual thing to be contemplative with the advent of Buddhism in China, and of course its adoption of Taoist traditions, which Taoism already had a contemplative tradition, so it kind of pulls that up and really increases that tradition and makes it bigger. By the 8th century, we have Buddhism as a uniquely Chinese thing. It is widely accepted, and there are multiple schools of Buddhism in China by that time. First, one of the schools I want to look at is the Tiantai. I'm really bad at Chinese. I apologize now. It's called the Heavenly Terrace. Chinese schools of Buddhism include the Heavenly Terrace, and it is focused on the Lotus Sutra. And remember, that's one of the last ones, might be the last one if I recall correctly. And it is the core of Mahayana teaching, right? This is the one that says, no, this is the real teaching that we have kind of been working towards all this time. And it includes this idea of skillful means, which is basically saying it's okay to stretch the truth, maybe not fully lie, but it's okay to stretch the truth if you're pulling someone to the truth, to a greater truth, right? And so that becomes a part of Chinese Buddhism. It includes the doctrine of emptiness, and it's expressed in 3 levels. So number 1, all dharmas are empty of any intrinsic identity, okay? Things exist dependently, and all things are actually both empty and dependent at the same time. So it's kind of like you have this ultimate reality, right? The ultimate reality of nirvana and emptiness, and everything is nothing, and everything in the world is an illusion, and kind of like this ultimate philosophical, contemplative reality and truth. And then there's the mundane truth, right? The super mundane truth of my office is a disaster area, and I have a list of stupid mundane tasks I need to get done in the next few days, but I also have to finish dealing with grades, and I got to get those papers graded, and I got to get grades entered, and my computer is barely powerful enough to handle everything I need to do, and I want another mocha, right? Those mundane, stupid things, right? And the truth is, they're both true at the same time, because the ultimate reality includes the mundane reality, and the mundane reality is a covering for the ultimate reality. So all of them, both sides of that coin are true. Okay? We're going to talk about that a little bit more later on. That's going to come up again. There are 3,000 worlds that are always present in an instant thought. Everything in the cosmos is present right now. Right? And that's that combination of the ultimate and the mundane happening at the same time. Every moment is the culmination and contains within it every moment that led up to it. Okay? Every drop of water in the ocean contains the ultimate nature of the ocean. Okay, so we're gonna come back to this again. Don't worry. It's gonna come back. The next one, and see, we're coming back to it again. This is the flower garland school, and the images I chose for this are not just beautiful images that are significant to that faith or that school. I have chosen these images because it is focused on looking at the mutual penetration of all things and the merging of all realities in all things, which is part of what we were just talking about. These images are actually images of the cosmos and ideas and looking at how everything is interconnected. So if you look at cosmology or astrophysics, they're looking at the potential and the possibility, and it seems to be accurate that actually the cosmos, the universe, is connected through these webs of dark matter, dark energy, and they come together in kind of nexuses, and then they come apart, and then they, are spread out, but they're all connected. And I wanted you to look at this because this is kind of like a really interesting physical manifestation of what Buddhism is trying to link to. And I also want to really point out again that ideas in religion and philosophy have pointed to these larger cosmological physical truths. And when you start hitting the cutting edge of physics and astrophysics and quantum physics, they start using language that circles back to philosophy. All of these ideas where you're looking at silos of knowledge, again, total lie, complete lie. Everything is connected. And I have recently come to the realization that if you want to understand God or deity or the numinosum, whatever you want to call it, you got to study physics. You got to study astrophysics and maybe particle physics, right? If you want to understand people, you study religion, right? That's and the humanities and the liberal arts. That's the human condition. If you want to understand the nature of deity and the nature of the ultimate realities of deity and the numinous, you go to physics, you go to science. and you find out and you start to understand it. God is not something that we can't understand. God is huge, and it may not be possible for a single person to understand the ultimate reality of all things, but together we can put it together, right? We can work together to figure it out. Anyway, point being, the Flower Garland School is looking at the mutual penetration of all things and the merging of all reality in everything. So again, that drop of water in the ocean is reflective of the entire ocean, okay? The cosmos is all in one and one in all, right? So the cosmos is entirely united, and every little thing in the cosmos is reflective of the larger whole. If you want to truly perceive all reality, all you have to do is truly perceive one instant, because all reality is reflected in every moment. So everything is networked together, and they relate it to something called Indra's net. And Indra's net is this kind of, Indra is a god in Hinduism, and his net is this fully connected net of crystals, and every crystal reflects every other crystal. And these crystals all reflect the ultimate reality. So the net itself is gigantic and huge, but every single crystal holds the reality of the whole thing. Okay, so it's Indra's net. Every moment is the culmination of every moment that came before it, and that's another way to think about it. Okay? I know, this is kind of mind-blowing. I hope it's mind-blowing. I'm hoping your brain is already getting squishy. It should be. If it's not, then you need to sit down and contemplate this. It might require wine or something like that. I don't condone these things officially. Okay. The next school that comes out of this is Chan, which becomes Zen in Japan. So Zen actually gets its start in China. It is the meditation school of China. It is focused on the Bodhidharma, not the Bodhidharma, a man called Bodhidharma, which totally confuses me because, Bodhidharma is one thing and there's a guy now and I don't know. But he is an Indian saint. He sat meditating, facing a wall until his arms and legs fell off. He comes up with this thing when he's talking to his acolytes, right? And he's trying to figure out who's going to succeed him. And he asks one of them, what is reality? And he says, the mind is like a mirror covered in dust. In meditation, you have to wipe it clean, and that is enlightenment. But no, the Buddha nature is pure, right? And this is the answer from another guy. The Buddha nature is pure, and where there is any, where is there any dust, right? So true enlightenment is the realization that there is no dust. And actually, there's another Zen version of that says there is no mirror, right? There is no mind. So if there's no mind, there's no dust. It's again, your brain should be getting a little squishy. There's two styles of Chan. There's the gradual school and the sudden school. So even within this, they kind of split off. The gradual school says you have to sit and contemplate and, work it. And another school says, no, you sit and you contemplate and all of a sudden it will come to you immediately, right? The schools generally distrust words. They love paradox. So this is where we get the koans in the Zen school. And they are very focused on oral transmission. They tend to be a little more Taoist in their outlook. The Watercourse Way, concerned with nature, concerned with flowing with nature, and working within nature. All right. Other schools. The Pure Land School makes it to China and is very, very popular. It's very popular for both the peasants and the elite because there is hope beyond this world and this life, and it's not something you have to do on your own. You're not left to your own devices here, right? It offered a way for practice and contemplation that was different from the Chan or Zen school. It, of course, focuses on Amitabha to help you make it to the land of the Pure Land. Avalokiteshvara also becomes very popular. I may not be saying these names absolutely correctly. This is the way I learned them initially. Uh, I've heard them pronounced other ways, but again, with these names, sometimes you're looking at dialects that may come into play. You may be looking people who have only read it, right? They've only seen it read. I think I've also heard Avalokiteshvara. Um, I can't remember how the other guys pronounced it now, but that's okay. Don't worry. Uh, but the female manifestation in China is Kuan Yin. Also becomes very popular as a Buddha because Avalokiteshvara and Kuan Yin are kind of the Buddha of the family. And so there's a greater focus within that bodhisattva on the family and traditional life and making sure the kids get to bed on time and making sure, again, food gets on the table, those kinds of things. So Kuan Yin becomes very important there as well. Buddhism goes to Japan. All right, so that was the tiniest nutshell of China. All right, there's a huge, long history there, much more complicated, but I wanted to give you an idea of what's going on there. It goes into Japan around 535 CE, Common Era, and it gets there via Korea. Okay, I want you to remember and think about the fact that, like, China, Korea, Japan, all those areas are very geographically close. And although today we think of them as being very separate and distinct culturally, they have long distinct cultures, but there's a lot of communication going on there. And at various times, different groups will have dominance over others. So there's going to be a lot of affinity. There's going to be a lot in common as well. So it comes in via Korea. Japan is still engaged in feudal warfare, and they're kind of tired of this, right? Again, you're in a time of chaos, and they're looking for a new system that will keep the values that they have, but provide stability, right? And they want to keep up with their neighbors. They're looking at China, and China's kind of coming into a more peaceful way, right? And they seem to be much more at ease, and so they're looking at China, going, "What are you guys doing over there?" Because we'd like some of that. So Japan adopted some of the Confucianism, but they also adopted the Buddhism, and it helps them reorganize the state and the community. And that leads to a different development of Buddhism because it's in a different context with people with different needs, right? So that's going to be a little bit different. There was no similar system or philosophy in Japan, the way that Taoism was in China. Japan had a very different indigenous tradition, right? So Taoism is an indigenous tradition of China. Shinto is the indigenous tradition of Japan. There's another name for it in Japanese that I don't remember right now. But hopefully you guys know what I'm talking about because you have taken other courses that kind of focus on the East, probably, or you will. I'm sure you will. So Buddhism helps to create a unified Japanese people, right? But it has to, again, it's got to be flexible because it's got to go in and smeld and work with Confucianism, which is that long-standing indigenous tradition that's already there. You can't just overthrow it and say, well, we're done with that. We're going to do something totally different, right? Now for something completely different. Cultures don't work that way. So we're going to take a look at Shinto first. So like I said, it's the indigenous tradition. It is concerned with sacred geography. Japan is a sacred space. Oh my gosh, the mountain, I can't remember it now. Anyway, there are sacred mountains. There's lots of sacred mountains in Japan. So it's concerned with that sacred geography. It includes the veneration of nature spirits. And it also includes a veneration or worship of the ancestors. All right. And again, Buddhism has nothing to do with the nature spirits. Buddhism doesn't care about the spirits of the trees or the land or the rocks or the ancestors even, right? The ancestors die, they get reincarnated. It's not like they were really real anyway, right? It was all an illusion. So that's one of the things that Buddhism has to kind of work within. Within Shinto, of course, the kami are the deities or the supernatural forces. They can be protective or destructive. Shinto is not anything like Buddhism, but eventually it becomes complementary, and the kami become complementary to the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas. Okay, and they become venerated together as part of like the same supernatural energy that's all around you. All right. Eventually, Shinto Buddhism becomes the state religion. So Buddhism works its way in and becomes a part of that indigenous tradition. Although today there are Shinto priests and there are Shinto people and there are Shinto shrines that are separate from Buddhism, but Buddhism really works its way in there to kind of work within that. But that's part of its flexibility, and that's part of the way it spreads is through being flexible. So it enters during the Nara period, or it comes in and really gets a hold during the Nara period. Nara was the capital during this period. The Emperor Shomo is ruling at this time, and he built Todaiji, which is a symbol of the relationship between Buddhism and the Japanese state, and that's that temple down at the bottom there. It houses a huge bronze statue of Dainichi, which is the Buddha of the sun, right? And it complements the sun goddess of the kami and represents illumination. And that Buddha is in the top corner there. All right. Monastic practices were established in Japan, and that becomes also part of the landscape. So Japanese Buddhism does adopt some of that monasticism. China did as well. But of course, this is all part of a larger Mahayana movement. Okay. During the Heian period, we have the capital move to Kyoto. This is kind of a high period of courtly life and sophistication, and it leads to two important schools in Buddhism. The Shingon school, which is the true word, and it's based on Chinese Tantra, right? And we're going to look a little bit further into Tibetan Buddhism, which is Tantric Buddhism. But the mandalas of Tantric Buddhism, if you've ever seen Buddhist monks making a mandala with the sand, we're going to take a look at that in a few minutes. But it's really fascinating. So those mandalas get incorporated into courtly life, and they become part of the artistic aesthetic of courtly life in Kyoto. We also get the Tendai school, founded by Saicho, and that, again, emphasizing the Lotus Sutra. I would highly recommend, if you get a chance, take a look at the Lotus Sutra itself and read through it. And it's based on the Tiantai school in China, and it uses, of course, this idea of the great vehicle because it's part of the Mahayana school. So the great vehicle is used to unify the nation. So the whole nation gets into the great vehicle. And it helps to justify the extension of the emperor's power. And that, of course, can be a stabilizing force. So the Japanese state is kind of like the wheel, and the emperor becomes the center of the wheel. And in Buddhist art, that wheel is really, really important. You'll see that wheel. It's a wheel with 8 spokes, and at the center is enlightenment. So the more active your brain is, the more active your spirit and your mind are, the more on the outside of the wheel you are. And you take the eightfold path, the 8 spokes that go in, to get yourself to the center of the least amount of action, the least amount of disturbance. And the most still part of the wheel is at that direct center, and that's where enlightenment is. So that wheel becomes part of the symbolism, and the emperor is at the center, and that is like the stabilizing force. Okay, and the most still center, ideally. Not making any promises about actually. New movements in Japan. By the 13th century, the golden age of Buddhism was a memory that needed to be awakened. So, right, it went through a golden age of Buddhism, and hundreds of years go by, and they're looking backwards to that golden age, which is really, really common for humanity. And I think I've said this before. We always look to the past and we make it much rosier than it really was, right? It's always a golden age in the past. No one ever says, oh, we're living in a golden age right now, right? Very few people actually say it. So they're looking towards it. They want to reawaken this better age. And so one of the things that happens is that they simplify the practice, which had become overly ritualistic, overly demanding in many ways, and overly focused on meditation. Honen, one of the leaders at this time, preaches that you do not need meditation. You do not need higher education to understand the nature of the Buddha. All you need to do is chant Namu Amida Butsu, right? And this becomes also part of Soka Gakkai later on under Nichiren. So we're going to take a look at that as well. But Honen says, too much education gets in the way. You overthink it, it becomes overly abstract, overly out there, right? And it's no longer practical. So he wants to bring it back to being practical, right? So he says education gets in the way. You get caught in your head. So you have to believe like a child, and you have to do the chant, and that's all you have to do, right? And this becomes a sectarian split within Pure Land Buddhism. Nichiren, as promised. Nichiren Daishonin is a 13th century monk, also looking back to that golden age and wanting to revive it. So he starts writing, and he's like a really big personality, and he has no problem crossing people and pissing them off. So he gets thrown into the spotlight, and he also focuses on the Lotus Sutra. And he also makes chanting a central part of the practice. For him, the chant is Nam-myoho Renge-kyo, which some of you might actually know already. In fact, for him, the Lotus Sutra was the only sutra that mattered. The Diamond Sutra, the Heart Sutra, any of the Vedas, none of that other stuff matters. None of it. The Pali Canon, who cares, right? All he cares about is the Lotus Sutra, all right? He renounced the corrupt practices that were present in his time, or he claimed they were corrupt. And so he says, and this is very different for Buddhism, he says there is only one way. This is the only way, and I'm the one who's going to teach it to you. Right? And this is starting to sound really almost kind of Western, right? Because this idea that there is only one path and the rest of you guys are screwed is very much a Western attitude. Think about Islam, think about Christianity. This kind of exclusivism rings very Western to me. He denounced Honen and his disciple Shinran. He was not liked. People did not like him. And a couple of other sects, it leads to a couple of other sects like Risho Kosai Kai, and of course, the one you know about, Soka, right? So Soka Gakkai gets its foundation from Nichiren. So I'm just going to give you a little quick history about Soka because this is the university you're attending and you should know something about it. The founder of the movement, I always have trouble saying his name, Tunesaburo Makaguchi, I think. He is a teacher, and he published, he's living 1871 to 1944, so fairly recently. He was a teacher. He publishes his first volume on the philosophy of education, based in his understanding of Buddhism during the 1930s. So you can see already where Soka Gakkai gets its emphasis on education, because its founder, inspired by Nichiren, but also an educator himself, right? So he's going to put that education in there. He publishes in 1930. His primary disciple is Josei Toda. And of course, you can kind of tell by the pictures who comes first, second, and third. On the left, you have the first president, the first founder. Toda is on the right. So he and Toda, along with a bunch of other followers, they gain like tens of thousands of Japanese followers to this movement of Soka. But they get arrested during World War II. because the government is trying to reaffirm Shinto as the national religion, as the Japanese, this is who we are Shinto. And so Buddhism takes a dive during World War II because it's not a Japanese or originating tradition. So they do get arrested. They spend some time in prison. In 1951, Toda becomes the second president of Soka Gakkai, and he grows the movement quite a bit. Later on, Daisaku Ikeda, whose name you know from the Ikeda Library, right? He is still alive. He's not a young man. Uh, he he is Toda's disciple, and he grows Soka Gakkai from a Japanese thing to Soka Gakkai International. And so that's where you're getting SGI. And that's why Toda is such a big name in Soka, because he does bring it to an international stage. And after World War I, a lot of Japanese immigrants come to America, and they're bringing Soka with them. A lot of them are, not all of them. He is, I don't know if he has prepared for succession or not. I don't know what will happen when he passes away. He is going to die pretty soon, because 1928, man, he's older than my mother. And she's pretty old, so that's concerning. Anyway, it is a gigantic organization, and they have quite a bit of, they have some deep pockets, which you can see by looking at your own university. He also has a big vision, and he's able to accomplish it, and to which I gotta say, good on you. He does take some ideas from the West. For example, if you join Soka, if you become a part of the Soka Gakkai International, they do encourage a little bit of proselytization. It's not a huge part of it, but they do want you to go out and talk about it. So he's pulling from the West there, and that's in a Protestant vein. And this is not the only tradition that does that. Once Buddhism really gets into the West, they adopt a lot of those Protestant Christian practices and ideas, and we're going to see that again. But there are no ascetics. There are no monks or nuns that are part of Soka. In fact, Soka was affiliated with a group of ascetics, and they cut ties, like I want to say 10 years ago, but I'm not really sure. So it's a lay community. It is a lay. It's led by lay people. There's nobody who really gets paid to help lead this. But it creates a community. It creates a Buddhist community that anybody can belong to, and it's really easy to practice. It's just the chant you do. It's like the first and 16th chapter of the Lotus Sutra, something like that. I don't remember now. But all you have to do is chant Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, and then you can also do the recitation of the sutra in Japanese, and I think it's like a hybrid of Japanese and Chinese. I was never able to memorize it. But it's not culturally bound, and I think that's the point. You can be anybody, so anybody from the West can easily practice it. And it does give an actual practice with no real attendance required. You don't have to go to temple to practice it, right? So it gives space also for education. So it continues that really big emphasis on education, which again, you already know because you're attending Soka University, all right? And I love that emphasis on education. I'm all about the education. Another school that comes out of Japan is the Zen school. Now, Zen is actually a mistranslation or a mispronunciation of Chan, which is actually a mistranslation / pronunciation of jhana, which is meditation in Sanskrit, right? So you can kind of see where the language is, they're trying to get this language across, but the sounds in one language don't translate to another language very well. So Zen is actually, the word supposed to mean meditation. So they're working towards emptiness to prepare for awakening. All right. Again, Zen practice has to be translated directly from a teacher. You're not supposed to learn it from a textbook or just watching YouTube videos or something like that. It is transcendental meditation that comes from India. So its origins are well rooted in Indian ascetic practices. One of the things they do is they focus on koans, right? So a koan practice is designed to kind of tweak your mind into emptiness. So very famous koans include, like, does the dog have the Buddha nature? What is the sound of one hand clapping? That one about the tree, like if a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, doesn't make a sound, that's a koan. That goes back to Zen practice, all right? It stresses self-reliance and discipline and eventually does connect to the martial arts. Later, enlightenment through koans and disciples implies that there's a different experience than normal experience. Okay, so this creates a problem. So if you're saying that you have to create emptiness to attain enlightenment, you have engaged a dualism. There's the emptiness and then there's the mundane. And once you have that dualism, you're screwed. Okay, and you can see here in the cartoon, and I love this cartoon. What do you do when you have freed yourself from all desire except the desire to free yourself from desire? Right? That's a real legitimate question for Zen Buddhism. You know, you're supposed to be free of all desire, free of Trishna, right? But your desire to be free of desire is a desire itself. Right? And you're still stuck. Let me see here. Let me make sure I've covered everything. Oh, Sazen. Sazen was the other school that I wanted to point to. Sazen does not focus on the koans as much. It is simply a sitting meditation. You just sit there until there is a moment when you have enlightenment, right? And this is that sudden enlightenment school. You have to become time. So here again, we see this, this everything is encompassed in one thing. So when you're sitting there, your goal is to become time. Every moment is an eternity and encompasses everything and every moment in that 1 second that you exist. Right? And we're back to one drop of dew reflects the entire cosmos. So we're back to this whole everything is in one thing and one thing is everything. All right. And this is also where you get a Zen garden, right? You know about the Zen gardens with the rocks and the big rocks surrounded by the sand. And the Zen garden is used as a tool for meditation, not necessarily for staring at it, although it is very lovely to look at. But really, what they're doing is, especially with young monks, the beginning of their training is to maintain the Zen garden. So the raking of the sand is itself its own meditation, and that becomes part of the training for the young Zen monks that choose to follow this way. Let's see here. And again, we're going back to 3 levels of understanding: emptiness, mundane, and then the combined, which is the totality of experience. All right. So remember, I was talking about you become time. It's not that you are removing yourself from reality. You become all of reality. Right? You're not totally empty. You are everything, which in itself is a form of emptiness. Okay. Think of it this way. And this is a very mundane kind of example, but we say that, every person is special and unique. But if every person is unique, is that really unique anymore? Right? Things are only special because they're different. If everything is different, then it's no longer special, right? In order to have difference, you have to have the other side, which is the same. So it's kind of this weird place where you have 2 ideas and they are mutually exclusive, and yet they are both true. Every individual person is unique and different and special. And in being unique, different, and special, you are just like everybody else. There you go. All right, now that I have explained it all to you and it's perfectly clear and your brain is totally pulled it on, we're going to move on to Tibetan Buddhism because that's a lot of fun. So this is the Vajrayana school of Buddhism, and this is, I'm separating this out kind of as the third big branch. This is Tantric Buddhism. It is primarily in Tibet. It can be traced back to northern India between the 3rd and 13th centuries CE. It has a high monastic culture in India with lots of intellectual activity. And of course, they trace it all the way back to the Buddha himself, Shakyamuni Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama. But, you know, the history behind that is, I'm always skeptical when you start saying, oh, the history. That's your tradition. Show me evidence, right? And I need evidence. But the tradition takes it all the way back to the Buddha. These people did not choose, the tradition itself is not focused on living in the world or being of the world. It's a retreating tradition, right? So they're going to leave the family, they're going to leave society and go be monks off, right? And in India, these are the people who would go off into the forest and the caves and become ascetics, right? And this was really big in the Shaivite tradition in Hinduism. And this also, that those traditions move into Buddhism and become Tantric Buddhism. They embrace the taboo in order to dispel its power and attraction. All right. So that's, again, part of that old ascetic tradition in Hinduism becomes part of Buddhism. If something is taboo, embrace it, right? If wine is taboo, you may spend all of your time thinking about the evils of wine and why is it wrong and what is wrong with wine and what is the demon in the wine. And they're saying, you know what? Drink the bottle. Drink the whole bottle and then you're over it and you don't have to worry about it anymore. It's no longer taboo. It's no longer grabbing your attention because it's taboo. No, drink the bottle, have a hangover, throw your guts up the next day, and you're not even going to be worried about it. Rock on. Have at. All right. So, for example, in the Shaivite tradition, these are the people who would live in the cremation grounds. Why? Because the dead body is a taboo thing. So what are we going to do? We're going to embrace the taboo and get over it. Tantra is a form, like I said, is a larger religious tradition in India. The transmission of Tantra from teacher to student is kind of like the thread of that weaves reality together. All right. Power is it. This teaching is a way of cultivating power in the tradition and the religion. The word Vajra is the thunderbolt that slices through reality. So you embrace the taboo, and you are you go through your teaching with your teacher, your yogi, your whatever, your guru. Your in Buddhism it would just be a teacher. And you do the practices, and hopefully the thunderbolt hits, and you are able to see through normal reality and normal consciousness. You're kind of able to see the falseness of it, and that leads to enlightenment, and that leads to an experience of awakening that is as hard as a diamond, right? So once you're awakened, you fully understand, and it's kind of creates this unbreakable understanding of true reality. The vehicle of meditation is through the mantra. So simply uttering the correct syllables, right, has power. And so if you ever get a chance to listen to like throat singers, those guys with the super deep voice and they can do multiple tones at one time, take a look at YouTube if you want to find that. Look for throat singing. And they have power in and of themselves. And so, for example, the syllable Om in Hinduism, for Soka, the mantra is Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. etc. Soka is not part of this tradition, but it's another example of the chanting, okay? Let's see here. So, of course, their focus, like everybody else, is overcoming duality. So how do they do this? The Buddha looks like a demon in some of their work. So this guy is actually a Buddha, but he looks like a demon, right? He looks very evil, very foreboding. Uh, Toxic emotions of wrath and passion cannot be overcome by denial, but by experiencing them and changing them to peace. So when you look at the Buddha and you see wrath and anger and passion, right? This is what you should experience so that you can overcome it and move on towards peace. So when you look at that, you don't want to be afraid of it. You shouldn't be afraid of it because it's the expression of overcoming it. All right? Passion and stuff, it's neither good nor bad. It's not either or, but it's all of the above, right? So passion and anger, again, you don't overcome it by denying, you experience it, and that brings you peace, and you remove passion by means of passion, okay? If you're worried about the bottle of wine, or if you're worried about the glass of wine, drink it, all right? And then you know, and you're not curious anymore. Vajra and the bell, these are the male and female symbols, right? Symbols of duality that must be unified and overcome. So the bell is the feminine, the Vajra is supposed to be like a lightning bolt, and that's the masculine. So the practitioners are concerned with direct experience of both purity and impurity, the condoned and the not condoned, realizing that duality is imposed and artificial, and realizing that and fully internalizing that through the experience of it. Okay? And again, you have to have a teacher to guide you through this. In Tantric Buddhism, that's a lama. So, for example, we have the Dalai Lama, which is our most famous Lama. He is not the only one, but he is the most famous, and he is kind of the de facto leader of Tibetan Buddhism. But the once you overcome the duality of masculine, feminine, this and that, condoned and forbidden, etc., that is going to lead you to ultimate emptiness. All right, so within Vajrayana, one of the traditions or one of the expressions of their faith is through the mandala. The mandala is typically a circle, although there are other shapes in it. So the circle is the most simple shape, and within that form are the four directions, with the center being the fifth point. Okay, 5 becomes a very important number in Tantric Buddhism. So there are 5 points of the mandala. There are the 5 Buddhas of the mandala, and they change, and they might change places depending on the symbolism they're looking for. At the center is Akshobhya Buddha. Yeah, he is the unshakable, right? So it symbolizes the space as an element. So the mandala draws a circle around that space and then unifies reality at the center. Right, so there are 5 Buddhas, 5 skandhas, 5 forms of consciousness, 5 forms of unfavorable states, and there are 5 colors within the mandala: the green, the blue, the white, and the red. Right, and there are also 5 yoginis, so 5 female sides of it, and it goes on. So 5 becomes really important, and what you're looking at here. You're looking at some of the monks who are creating a mandala, and they create it with this colored sand, and you can see the little cups of colored sand, and they use these long, tapered, almost like a frosting tip, sort of, but much longer, to kind of get in there and do this really, really detailed, super, super detailed work. And then when they're done with it, they might leave it there for, a few days or so. But then they ritually clean it up, and then they take that sand as blessed, and they might distribute it to the people, or they might just let it go in the wind. which is really interesting. And I think anybody who's an artist kind of understands, or if you've ever spent a lot of time on a work of art, you understand that the art and the artist are not entirely separate, right? Your art is part of you. And so in some ways, this idea of spending hours and hours and hours and days on this thing, and the detail and the beautiful shading of color, suddenly, just sweeping it up and letting it go seems counterintuitive. But that's part of the expression and part of the symbolism of the mandala. Right, so here's another mandala. Or another expression of it. So it's not just in sand, it is part of the overall artwork of Tantric Buddhism. So it's associated with consciousness, anger, and midday sometimes. The mandala in the end represents reality. It's the middle ground between the microcosm and the macrocosm, the eternal, existential ultimate reality, and the mundane. It's that middle ground in between. Everything in it has symbolic significance. It represents the wholeness of the world and the self, and those things connected to it. It also symbolizes the chakras of the body. If you get more into Buddhism, and especially Tantric Buddhism, they talk about the chakras of the body going from the base of the spine all the way up to the very top of your head where the crown is, and it follows the color spectrum. And you can meditate and awaken the Kundalini snake to awaken and revive those chakras and pull them into alignment and hopefully gain enlightenment that way. That's in Hinduism. So it is the connection between the self and the rest of the universe. And you see symbolism if you look at other traditions. Very often mandalas, the circular shape is important as a symbol of wholeness. And even Carl Jung, when looking at UFO cults of the 1970s and even into the 80s, UFO cults are looking to the sky and seeing this circular object, and it seems to represent wholeness and a source of salvation. So I think that's really interesting when you start looking at other traditions and seeing how circles play out in those traditions. Of course, the leader, and I already mentioned this, the leader of Tibetan Buddhism is the Dalai Lama. He is perhaps the most visible spokesman for Buddhism. He has really become the face of modern Buddhism. He is number 14 in the line of incarnations that go all the way back to the 14th century. Number 13 died in 1935, and the search for the new incarnation started. He is the same leader reincarnated. He is the only one. He's just the most. He is not the only Lama, like I said before. He is the most important one, though. So he is, like I said, he's important on many, many levels. So when he dies, whenever that is, in the next decade, within the next decade, when he passes away, the search will be on again. And there will be monks going out of Tibet looking for the Dalai Lama again, his next incarnation. Now, what they will do, what they have done, what they did last time is, they get an omen, a portent, a dream. One of the ones that looks for the Lama has the dream and gives them an idea of where geographically to look. So the last time they ended up in like a small farming town, looking, going through all the children, trying to figure out which one it is, had a bunch of objects that were formerly in the possession of the Dalai Lama, and came across this little kid, this little toddler, and he correctly identified all of the objects that belonged to him. So it's kind of like a multiple choice exam, right? Which of these belong to you and which ones do not? There was one that he got wrong, that he pushed away, that supposedly belonged to the former Dalai Lama. Upon further investigation, it was found out that he was in possession of the object, but it did not actually belong to him. So there you go. Even when he was incorrect, he was still correct. He has joked about coming back as a white a white teenager in America or England or, especially when the Chinese government presses him and they start threatening to, we're going to name the next Dalai Lama, that kind of thing. He went into exile in 1959 with the Chinese occupation of Tibet that had begun in the early 50s. He went to North India to live, and he still lives there. When he went into exile, one of the things he did is he consulted with a bunch of rabbis about how do you maintain your identity, how do you exist in exile, but maintain your religious and ethnic and cultural identity. Spoke to the rabbis about it because remember, Judaism was in exile in the diaspora after the Roman occupation and only went back, nearly 2,000 years later. So he was in consult with them. The Dalai Lama has done quite a bit for the face of Buddhism, for bringing it much more into the public eye, even than some of the other modern writers. There have been quite a few celebrities that have spoken out to, return the Dalai Lama to Tibet. He speaks a lot. He does a lot of public speaking. And he's a very interesting character, and if you ever get a chance to see him speak, I highly recommend that you do. He's incredibly well informed about all forms of Buddhism. He is very, very open to talking to other traditions and loves to do that interfaith dialogue, which I think is so important in modern society in order to kind of open up different groups and open up that diversity. The Dalai Lama means the ocean Lama, or the ocean of wisdom. It's a title that was given initially by one of the Mongol rulers of Tibet, Altan Khan, right? Given to number 3 in the lineage. Then at that point, the Lamas and the Tibetan Buddhists had Mongol support. So we see that tie between religion and politics happening there. So with Mongol support, they had more spiritual power, and the political leader had more power because they were supporting each other. The current Dalai Lama has combined politics and spirituality in very unique ways, because he does carry a lot of cultural and social cachet when he speaks. And so when he speaks out about things, people listen, and that gives him that authority. And the same is going to be true of the Pope. The same is going to be true of any religious leader that has the ear of the public, which the Dalai Lama seems to have. When he presents Buddhism, when he is on stage talking to a large group of people and presenting Buddhism, he focuses on the removal of suffering. So he's focusing on some of the really basic tenets, going back to that core of Buddhism, right? And he points out, we all want to be happy, but he uses the vocabulary from the audience. And I think that's a really important thing, because when you're able to use the vocabulary of the people you're talking to, it means that you have listened. It means that you have actively listened and practiced that empathy and said, okay, what is your position? How do you understand your place in the world? How do you describe yourself? And that implies, of course, heavily implies a level of respect. And in order to get people to be in conversation with you, you have to show that practiced empathy, that level of respect. And so I think that's really interesting. His message is very simple. He just goes through the 4 noble truths, right? We're all suffering, but there is release, nirvana. There's release through nirvana, and of course, the middle way, the Eightfold Path, right? He also stresses the interdependence of humanity, right? And this is kind of an extension of that dependent co-arising, right? Everything is connected, and this is very true of Buddhism, but I think it's really becoming more and more salient and what's the word I'm looking for? A more and more powerful message today, because it's so true, and we see it so so much more powerfully now with our economic interdependence, our social interdependence, and I think especially now when we see this virus being spread across the globe, right? It starts in this town in China, and so quickly it ends up in England and the US and Canada and Africa and India and right all over the globe. It spreads so quickly. And that's that, just a really visceral and really obvious example of that interdependence of humanity that the Dalai Lama has been speaking about for decades. He always promotes compassion and tries to give tools to help people practice compassion. And one of the things he tells people is that you should envision every person as if that person were your mom in a previous life. And would you say those things to your mom? Would you treat her that way, right? You have been connected to everybody and everything, right? Everything exists in a single instance. The entire ocean is reflected in that drop of water, right? And he preaches that practiced empathy that I've been talking about. He is not interested in converting anybody. He doesn't want you to convert to Buddhism. That's not his goal. In fact, he has said that, whatever faith you were born into, whatever faith is powerful to you that you're comfortable in, be that, but be the best Christian you can be the best Jew that you can be the best Hindu you can be compassionate, be loving, talk to other people respectfully, and be the best that you can be in whatever faith you happen to be in, which I think is an amazing message. Buddhism in America and modern Buddhism is really interesting, and the reason I pulled this Tibetan form of Buddhism to the end was because it does play directly into modern incarnations or modern takes on Buddhism, because the Dalai Lama is such at the forefront of modern Buddhist thought right now. But Buddhism in the West goes back further than that, obviously. There's lots of forms here. Obviously, Soka is one of them. There are other Buddhist forms in the United States. There's a really big Buddhist temple in, I think, like Laguna Beach or something like that. And from what I've learned about them, they're very similar to Soka. They do their meetings in much the same way, and they have similar values and priorities. We first make contact with Buddhism in the West and in Europe, in the United States, Canada, that kind of thing. We first really make contact in the 19th century, so the 1800s, through colonialism. And that's through colonialism in Southeast Asia, all right? William Jones is a British guy, and he is like a colonial officer in Southeast Asia. And he was really important to institutionalizing the study of Sanskrit. Europeans had never come across this before. It was not something that was really studied. Everybody had been very focused on the ancient Near East, right? So they had studied cuneiform, Hebrew, Ugaritic, those kinds of things, but they never really went into India. So this becomes really important because it's new to the West and it's a part of our own culture, because Sanskrit is the mother language of Latin and Greek, right? And that's like super important in Western ideas, in the Western mind. But it's also important because Buddhism had all but died out in India. And so the Sanskrit, the Pali Canon, was really close to being lost in Sanskrit and Pali, which is another language within India, predates Sanskrit even. So that those writings were in danger of being lost. So with William Jones, it kind of pulled it into the West and preserved it for us. We get a French scholar, Eugene, I don't think I can pronounce this, Bernoulli, I think, something like that. They do that weird guttural R that I have trouble with. But he wrote the first introduction to Mahayana Buddhism in French. but it was really good because even in French, a lot of people knew French, were bilingual in French, and of course the Brits very well versed in French, and Canadians well versed in French, and learned people of the time knew French. So he writes this introduction to Mahayana Buddhism, and that becomes really influential to Henry David Thoreau, right? So if you've read Thoreau, he's being influenced by Buddhism, and you can kind of see that. By the end of the 19th century, it comes across from Europe to America, and it starts influencing our understanding of you know the East, and we start understanding it a little better. Madame Blavatsky and Sir, I think it's Henry something Alcott. These two are really active in the kind of spiritualist movement of the 19th century. During the Civil War, of course, people are losing people in America. Everybody knows someone who has lost, or they have lost somebody. Huge numbers of people are dead. And so the spiritualist movement in America is this movement to, most commonly seen as, the movement to contact the dead, get seances and the Ouija board and stuff like that. It gets very popular. But Madame Blavatsky is also interested in religion, and she starts what's called the Theosophical Society. She's a very eccentric character. I wouldn't trust her interpretation of Buddhism particularly, but she is instrumental in getting our attention pulled to Buddhist thought. Let's see here. Alcott, even her buddy, wrote something called the Buddhist Catechism. And notice the word catechism is used there to kind of grab that Western attention and give you an idea of what's happening there. In addition to that, we get the World Parliament of Religions in 1893, and that's that lower picture of all those gentlemen. Of course, maybe one or two women. I think Madame Blavatsky was there. So that's the World Parliament of Religions, the first one in Chicago. And there are Buddhist and Hindu leaders there who get to share their tradition from their own perspective, which is incredibly important for accuracy to really understand what it is, right? And so they get to teach their faiths to us, and they get to engage in dialogue with Americans and Europeans as well. And then you also get Asian Americans who are coming to America, and of course the Chinese and the Japanese have been here for generations and generations, right? They start setting up and organizing religious communities. During the 80s in Hacienda Heights near LA, the Shilai Temple went up, and it is the largest Buddhist temple with a monastery in it. So there's a sangha there, there's monks and nuns there. It's part of the Chinese Mahayana tradition. It's really great if you get a chance to go take a field trip up there once we are released from our homes. Go and see it. It's really, really beautiful. It comes out of Taiwan, so it's in the Chinese vein, but politically you want to keep Taiwan as a different thing. But it shows the incredibly diverse Buddhist communities in America, and especially in California. Hermann Hesse, of course, contributes with this. In 1951, he was actually German, raised in India, though, because his father was a diplomat. And his work, Siddhartha, gets translated into English in 1951. And that's a nice modern spin on Buddhism, and asks, even though it doesn't follow the story of Siddhartha very strictly, it's a really wonderful exploration of Buddhist thought and Buddhist ideas, and really evokes a lot of the questions that Buddhism wants you to ask. And then in addition, we have the Naropa Institute in Colorado, which was established in the 70s, a Buddhist institute, a Buddhist university. So Soka is not the first Buddhist university in the U.S., but it's one of the few. And then, of course, you guys know Soka University was established only, 20, 30 years ago. All right. So that brings us to the end of Buddhism. I'm going to post the last quiz on this as soon as I can, as soon as I get this edited and posted to YouTube. and that will be your last quiz for the class for Soka. If you have any questions, please write them down so that you can ask me. And even if it's even if you don't get a chance to ask me for whatever reason during the semester, please feel free to email me and let me know that you don't understand something or you want to explore something deeper. All right. So either way, please take care. Stay well. I will see you guys. Hopefully, see you very soon. Hopefully, be on campus next semester. I'm still really hopeful for that. I am doing next semester. I'm doing Goddess Tradition. So if you want to sign up for that, please do. And I will see you guys later. Bye.